Now, another aspect of working at or responding to an incident is not only we got to be concerned about our dose, the damage to our body, which as we remember is simply the dose rate times time. Well, it all depends on what that dose rate is. If we're at 1 Rankine per hour, which there's only been a few times I've even been in an area that had a Rankine or near close to a Rankine per hour, you can spend an entire day there before you hit your 25 rem limit, according to EPA. Now, as you increase that dose rate, of course, you got to decrease the time. But even something in the realm of 100 Rankine per hour, which is extraordinary, you still have 15 minutes to do some work before you hit that 25 rem limit. So we teach a lot of hazmat teams, rescue, they can go in and rescue someone in 15 minutes, even though they're in a very severe radiation field. So all depends on knowing what you're doing and considering these two variables here. Now, as I mentioned, dose is cumulative over time. And so if you're exposed to a source, and I'm just going to make up some dates and times here, over an hour on March 5th, and you would accumulate a half a rem, that half rem goes against your 5 rems for the year. Then let's say on April Fool's Day, you obtain 1.5 rems over a 2-hour period, and then you do another entry that afternoon, and you get another half a rem. Well, your total now is 2.5. And then on Halloween, some jokester plays a prank, and you spend a couple hours in an area, and you get another 2 rem. Well, your total now for the year is 4.5. And so you're within a half a rem of your legal limit, which means if you're a first responder or some other professional that works with radiation, you got to really watch what you're doing to make sure you don't hit your or exceed your limit. It's cumulative over your lifetime also. So it starts at age 18. Before the age of 18, you're not allowed to have an exposure to radiation, at least occupationally. And every year you get 5 rems. So when you're 20, you cannot have more dose than 10 rems cumulative. And as the older you get, that number increases. So by the time you reach my age, you should not have exceeded 260 rems. I know, I look really young for my age. It's all the bourbon. And really what this chart is saying is, yes, you can exceed 5 rem per year. So how would you ever exceed this limit? Well, if you were to go over your 5 rem in a year, for whatever reason, say that first responder who hits 25 rem, well, they've used up 5 of their years. Then they'd have to be very careful based on their age to make sure their cumulative doesn't exceed that. And that's an extraordinary situation. But we do have regulations that protect folks. Now, some misconceptions about exposure. You cannot become radioactive if you're exposed to radiation. Okay, it's not going to make you glow either, which may become a big disappointment to you. So the things that Homer Simpson taught you are wrong. You know, nuclear radiation, the materials itself do not naturally glow. They're all from secondary interactions. This is a photograph of a nuclear power plant, a reactor, and this blue glow that you see comes from deceleration of beta as it goes through the water. Decelerates and it releases blue light. It's a beautiful blue color. If you ever have a chance to see a small reactor at a university, and you can look in the pool and see the glow. It's mesmerizing. Highly recommend it. But it cannot make you radioactive. You can become contaminated if you get the radioactive material on your body or in your body. And as we know, there are, as far as exposures, external and internal exposures, and of the internal contamination, it comes from either inhalation, ingestion, absorption, or injection.
They just had that guy standing over, he fell in the pool of water, and his exposure was only 5 milligrams, I think.
So that San Jose had an incident just recently. And nuclear power plants do have large pools of water. They use a lot of water to cool the reactor and to moderate the chain reaction. So these pools are fairly deep. There's a lot of water, and they contain some of the nuclear fuel as it undergoes thermal and radioactive decay. And if you fall into it, yeah, you're going to have some exposure. But at the surface, there's usually very minimal exposure. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story. The first nuclear reactor I saw was when I was in college. My chemistry professor was a nuclear chemist. He's the one that kind of spurred my interest in this field. And we went to a local university that had a small research reactor. And the building was quite large. The reactor was probably about, I would say half the size of this room and about 30 feet deep. And it was just an open pool of water. And you could look in and see the reactor core with all the fuel rods and control rods and the blue glow. And we're standing right there at the edge of this pool. And being young and a smart aleck, I asked our host, said, well, I can't believe you let us just walk up to this pool, radioactive, where the reactor is. Because what if I fell in? He goes, you get wet. So what about the radiation? He goes, no exposure whatsoever. So, I wasn't going to be challenged. Stop right there. I said, well, okay, I'm going to jump in and dive towards the reactor and swim towards it. He goes, go ahead. You'll get within 10 feet and you'll be dead. That's as far as you'll get. I didn't try, obviously. So the water, yeah, there's small exposure, but very, very minimal. So again, external exposure is contamination on your skin, and we're talking about the radioactive material itself. We're not talking about the alphas and the betas and the gammas. Those don't stick to you. They're energy. They expend their energy, they damage your cells, and then they're done. Now, you get the material that emits the alpha, beta, gamma in you, then that's a problem. Because it's going to continue to decay over time and cause that damage. So, radiation exposure is not contamination. We're talking about the actual material that gets on your skin, on your personal protective equipment. That contamination hopefully can be wiped off, can be removed. There's different methods to do that. It's only when that contamination is in you that we become, of course, very concerned. Any questions so far? Yes? It can, but you have to be exposed to pretty high levels of neutrons, and that's extraordinary. There's a few devices out there. I'll show you an example coming up here of one that does produce neutrons, called a nuclear density gauge. But even that, there's just not enough that's going to cause a health effect, at least serious health effect. So for the most part, you don't have to worry about the neutrons. Let's see, we will take I guess we're probably a little overdue for, no, we'll take a break in a little bit here. We'll get through this section, and then I'll give you a quick break. how much radiation can you be exposed to before it becomes a health effect that you should be worried about? Well, let's talk about action levels. How much is too much? So we have come up with our own system. And I say we, the emergency response section of EPA, we've developed a 3-level action series here to break it down and make it simple for you. So we would call routine actions, critical actions, and volunteer actions. And we'll go through each one of these. Routine actions are day-to-day. Whether you're on emergency response, whether you're investigating a facility, clean up a site, whatever, that's routine. You're not worried about life-saving. You're not worried about protecting critical property like my bourbon collection. You're not saving large populations, protecting them. You're not doing any activity that's really critical. It's just day-to-day stuff. Well, in that case, our limit is the 5 rem per year, as we talked about. EPA guidance says 5 rems all activity. We've already talked about that. Now, for the dose rate that we can measure with our instruments, we have this 2 milliroentgen per hour. This is not a legal limit. You can certainly go into areas where it's much higher rate and be perfectly protective, but it's where the game begins in the world of reactivity. If you find something that's at 2 milliroentgen per hour, then you need professional help. Now, what is typical background? Well, it is typically around 20 microroentgen per hour, several orders of magnitude less. So we're talking something that's getting a fair amount of reactivity. Not harmful to you, but you could get over your head real quickly. So call for backup. Now, a critical action level is when we are dealing with life-saving, protecting property, protecting large populations, and there's a chance you could exceed an exposure level. Doesn't mean you will, it's just a chance. So the limits here are a little bit different. We've already talked about the 10 rem and 25 rem that EPA recommends. There's also an organization, a National Council of Radiation Protection and Measurement, NCRP. They're a national nonprofit organization. They are charged by Congress to conduct research into the health effects of radiation, produce standards for responding to incidences and measurement and calibration of detectors and so on. And so they make recommendations, come out with all sorts of research, of which then the United States is supposed to adopt through regulatory means and such. Well, they have produced a document that talks about responding to a terrorism event, dealing with radioactive material, and they recommend, same as EPA, 5 rems, all activities. Then here in California, California Emergency Medical Services Authority says that up to 50 rems for life-saving events. Huge disparity here, 5, 25, 10, 50. What's the right number? Well, there is no right or wrong answer. It all depends on the situation. And again, we're talking about critical action here, life-saving. You can go up to 50. I'd go up to 50 if I were going to save one of your lives. I'd be perfectly comfortable with that. We'll talk about the health effects here, but a little foreshadowing, not that big of a deal. Yes?
Do you remember offhand the exposures that, the workers in Japan were receiving? I remember there were numbers being thrown around on the TV, but I just don't remember what they were.
So the question was, what was the exposures, the dose that some of the workers received at Fukushima? I have not seen an official enough report that talks about that accurately. But my understanding is that some of them were probably up in this range.
They all use the older workers too.
Okay, so using the older workers, I was going to talk about that and the health effects, but the older you get, the less susceptible you are to radiation. It's not because you become invincible, it's because most of the effects of radiation is long-term. And we talk about cancer. Well, the older you are, you have less life left on you. So the chance of you getting cancer from that exposure is a lot less than someone younger. So we always want to send in the old guys first, and it's one of those rare times where experience doesn't pay. Yes? You're young, don't worry about it. You send the old guys in like us. So the question is, does the utility in Fukushima have everything under control? The reports I have read is they have declared, I think all of the reactors have reached a stable condition called cold shutdown, where there is not a possibility for continuing fission, which produces heat. That is the big problem. So did the rods go through the cement? Again, we don't have an official report. That's going to take a while, probably a few years is my guess, but some indications are that one of the reactors did have a severe meltdown that did breach one of the inner containments and did get into some of the secondary containment structures. These reactors are very, very robust. They have multiple containments. And so we always hear about the China syndrome, where the core melts through the reactor, through the core of the Earth, all the way to China. Well, I mean, it's a completely farcical and ridiculous concept made for movie and TV only. That cannot happen. Now, breaching the entire containment system of a nuclear reactor, I think in theory it can happen, but again, it would be a very extraordinary event. And I think it's somewhat theoretical. I'm not sure if anyone's actually proven that it can be done. It definitely has not happened in any reactor thus far. Chernobyl is a whole different story. That was not a meltdown, that was an explosion. An explosion, a reactor that had no containment to, well, what we consider containment. It had a cap on the top that exploded off, and it was a whole other mess. Very different than Fukushima. So we've talked about these dose limits ranging from 5 to 50 doing critical actions. For dose rates, the EPA, for their employees, their first responders, they recommend 10 Rankine per hour as their turn back. The NCRP also uses 10 Rankine per hour turn back. A lot of fire departments, hazmat teams I work with, also use that as their turn back. Now that doesn't mean you can't go beyond that dose rate. Just means you got to be prepared to do it. Better planning, better instruments, and such. 10 Rankine per hour is pretty serious. It's not going to kill you. You could spend how many hours before you reach your 25 rem? 2.5 hours. It's a long time. So it's not immediately dangerous, but it's cause for concern. Again, the R means rethink. The millirem means maybe. Now we get to the last action level. We call the volunteer action levels. Now, this is when you are volunteering to step up and take an extraordinary action to save someone's life, to stop a possible threat that could cause a bigger problem. And if you're that volunteer, you better have some advanced training and knowledge about what you're getting yourself involved in, especially the health effects from a very high exposure, is really what's necessary. And there is no limit. In fact, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, who monitors a lot of activities all over the world, especially Iran right now in their quest for building nuclear weapons, they do not recommend an upper limit. It's up to the incident commander, the situation. There may be a time where someone has to obtain a lethal dose in order to take action to save maybe a much larger population. Okay, so I can't give a recommendation on that. It's up to each individual and each organization. Now, I can tell you that for EPA, the game starts at 25 REMs, and the NCRP says up to 50 for life-saving, and above 50 is their voluntary life-saving or our actions. It's a little different than EPA. Again, what's right, what's wrong, all depends on the situation. Don't get too hung up on the numbers. As I alluded to, 25 REMs is typically our upper limit for most instances. Even if you're in a very high radiation area, 200 Rankine per hour, extraordinary. You could still do a lot of activities in that time period of 7.5 minutes. So it's the combination of time and exposure rate. And you have to know that relationship to avoid exceeding your exposure. So what are the health effects? Well, we talked about 5 REMs, 10, 25, 50. Well, let's look at this very simple table here. In the 0 to 35 REM, no symptoms, no medical problems. You're killing your white blood cells, you make them all the time, very quickly. You get up into the higher double digits, oh, some people might have a headache or a little bit of nausea, and that will set in pretty quickly within a few hours, and within a half a day, it'll be gone. You probably, if you didn't know you were exposed to radiation, you wouldn't even think it had to do with radiation. Just weren't feeling well. Happens all the time. Still no health problems. Even up to 125 REM, there's no medical issues that we have to treat. And it goes away pretty quickly, within a day. Extraordinary that somebody would get over 100 REMs. And then it's not until you get into the high hundreds that you start to get more severe problems, where you will require medical treatment. And even at 300 REM exposure, you're probably going to survive. You know, maybe the elderly or the young or someone who's really ill, they might not, but all of us, normal, healthy, 300, no problem. Anytime you exceed an exposure limit, you have to have a darn good reason for doing it. And you got to know what you're doing. You got to know the health effects. You got to have the proper equipment. And you got to consider the situation. There may be other hazards present that are more important than the radiation. And always get permission from someone else. Your health and safety officer, your incident commander, your supervisor, whoever it is, you got to blame someone. But think about before you take action. Okay, we've talked about exposure, dose. What about contamination? Well, there are no laws, for the most part. I've already mentioned that twice background is we consider something radioactive. Well, and that's the number we use for contamination. If you find yourself contaminated, taking a measurement at twice background, that needs to be dealt with. Either you need to remove the material, the protective equipment, your clothing, wash your skin once you're above twice background. And that and that applies to all these different levels here: routine, critical, or volunteer. All situations, twice background. So that's easy to remember. Now let's talk about food contamination for a second. Another problem with nuclear reactor instances is that they release reactive materials. It gets into the food supply. And this became a big concern with Fukushima, of course. It can become a concern here in California. We have 2 active nuclear power plants. One between LA and San Diego, the Songs, and the Diablo Canyon, which is up near San Luis Obispo. And those are all agricultural areas. So you have a release from a nuclear power plant, gets into onto all different types of agricultural products. People eat them. Internal contamination, internal exposure, bad. So we have several different authorities, state and national, that deal with coming up with standards of what's acceptable, just like all other types of contaminants, be they chemical or biological. We have them for radiological also. And those are reflected in an EPA document called the Manual of Protective Action Guides and Protective Actions for Nuclear Instances, and they're known as PAGs, Protective Action Guides. And they have ways to give the authorities some type of metric that if you get certain type of contamination on food products, then they have to remove from the marketplace. And here in California, Department of Public Health and the California Emergency Management Agency, they work together, and if there's a release from a plant, they will quarantine areas to prevent food products from getting into the marketplace. And it's taken very, very seriously, and they will lock down huge areas, many, many square miles, prevent farmers from harvesting their crops, producers from selling them, and so on.